So the idea for the novel came from real life experience. My stepson, who was 19 at the time, went out one evening with some of his friends to the cinema and for chicken and chips after, and he was stabbed. It was like the most random thing by a group of boys that they weren't in an argument or anything like that. And he was stabbed by like some young boy who was part of the group. He was knocked onto the floor, and then this group were telling this young boy to like shank him or whatever. And this young boy stabbed him, just the most random thing. So the police said that it might have been like a gang initiation thing. Anyway, when we got the call, my husband and I, to say that he'd been stabbed and he'd been rushed to hospital, my husband went to the hospital and I was waiting to hear back. And the mortal terror, the absolute terror of waiting for him to call, because you're reading constantly, you're hearing constantly about stabbings in the news, so many of them are fatal. But also I was like in complete shock, because I felt like I wasn't prepared in any way for that to be a part of his life, even though I know that it's very difficult raising boys, and that mums are worried about their families, are worried about their boys all the time. I know people who have moved to parts of the country that are safer specifically for their boys to grow up. Even though I knew all of that, I still felt like I was completely unprepared for this to ever enter our life. And I think it's because he's such a lovely, sensible young man. And so maybe I thought that because of that, because he wasn't hanging around with the wrong sort of people, or because he wasn't doing the wrong sorts of things, that offered some insulation. And it didn't. He's fine, and he's fully recovered. He says that he's fully recovered. He needed to have surgery, and there was a possibility, because the blade had nicked his spleen, that he could end up, if the operation didn't go very well, he could end up with a colostomy bag for the rest of his life. And I was thinking, how's this possible? How's it possible for like a young boy who's like doing all the right things to go out for an evening with his friends and to end up with a colostomy bag? I think that because of that experience, the shock of it, I felt like up until then, I knew that knife crime was an issue. It's impossible for you to not know that knife crime has been an issue for the last couple of decades. But I felt like I wasn't actually paying attention to it, that it was happening, but I was switched off. And then I was switched on from that moment. And I kept trying to understand why knife crime was happening. And also, I had a kind of obsession, really, with trying to understand people who commit knife crime, because sometimes the most silly, like people were dying, young people dying in fatal stabbings where the perpetrators made no effort to conceal their faces, to employ subterfuge, to avoid getting caught. Sometimes the entire thing would be captured on CCTV cameras. And these young people, really young people, were going to prison at an age where they should be living their best life, enjoying their youth to the fullness. And I was trying to understand what that said about how they perceived their lives and the quality of their lives, going to prison for a couple of decades, that they wouldn't even go to the trouble of trying to disguise themselves sufficiently so that that wouldn't happen to them. Just trying to understand all of that psychology. And I was just obsessed with it. I was reading up about knife crimes. I was paying attention. So my writing, it doesn't come from a place of having answers to anything. It comes from a place of having lots and lots of questions. And I had lots and lots of questions. Once I knew that I would be writing about it, because that's how it is for me, my process, that something occupies my mind and I cannot exercise it through any other way but to explore it through writing. So I knew that I was going to write about the issue. And for a while, I thought about like exploring it from the perspective of a young person or a couple of young people who are involved. But I felt like that they would not have the questions that I had, that they would not have the maturity of perspective to entertain the questions that I was entertaining. And that's what I wanted to explore, those questions that I had in my head. And so it felt natural, right, that I write it from the perspective of somebody closer to me in age who's lost a child. And then I would get the opportunity to work through my questions, basically, through writing the novel.
I did think of how at the schlock end of crime fiction, there can be a glamorization of violence, of crime, of this kind of tainted heroics of action, of affecting the world violently, but to win out. I guess the Godfather series is probably the one that everyone knows in film.
Yeah.
And I thought that the mother was a brilliant, I don't know why I'm using a football metaphor, but a brilliant shimmy to kind of elude all that and investigate in a different way without that glorification, if you like, or that without being sucked into the magnetism of that sort of dynamic of glorification of violence. Marcia's son dies. Would you say Marcia is a victim too? And I have in mind the French critics who wrote about victims in crime, but one is not a victim because one is hunted and directly threatened. One becomes a victim as soon as one is present at events whose definitive meaning one is unable to decipher, becomes a trap as soon as everyday life is turned upside down. The crime story, instead of signaling the triumph of logic, has then to consecrate the failure of rational thought. And I felt that Marcia, as a character, there's a great exploration of the psychological landscape of that state she was in when her son dies. Would you care to enlarge on that in any way?
Yes, she's definitely a victim of what's happened by association. I was particularly interested in exploring the issue from her perspective, because I think that when we read about and hear about knife crimes and stabbing fatalities, that it almost seems as though it's a purely male issue, that the people who are doing it are men, that the people who are dying and injured are men. And there's an absolute, almost complete absence of female voices or any even idea that actually there are women who are absolutely devastated and yet still having to continue with their lives, to raise children in the absence of fathers, in the knowledge that their fathers will never be part of their lives ever, whether that's because they've died or they're in prison. And mums and dads, but always mums, who are absolutely devastated, who have, spent so many years in all that investment of love and care and energy. I speak for myself as a parent. My objective is to get the children to adulthood safely so that they can stand independently and take their place in society and soar, fulfill their potential.
In essence, what I'm curious about is whether, I'm always curious, this is kind of a writerly thing, whether you just went on and wrote from her perspective or wrote out her consciousness intuitively or instinctively, or whether you kind of went to somebody's the 5 stages of grief. I think that part of the fascination of the brilliance of the novel is it's so psychologically, it's so true.
So yes, the idea began with my experience. I was then very focused on reading about, watching, listening to stuff around knife crimes. I spoke to a couple of mums who had lost their sons violently, both of whom had gone on to create charities. In one case, Yvonne Lawson, who set up and runs the Godwin Lawson Foundation, which aims to break down postcode barriers by getting football teams from different areas to taking them out of their area so that they can play sports with each other, and to recognize, I suppose, that they have more in common than differences. And they also do a lot of stuff going into schools, talking to children about, young people about knife crimes. And the JAGS Foundation, again, set up by Tracy Ford, who lost her son in the most random way. He went to an ice skating birthday party and was killed on the ice, and no one's ever been convicted for that. And I found it like astonishing speaking to them, because I felt like if we weren't so fortunate as for our experience to have ended well, to have not ended badly, I don't know how I would have dealt with that. So when I was talking to Yvonne, she was saying to me that when she went to the court case for the boys that were charged with her son's murder, that she was so filled with rage and so much anger at the beginning. And then as she listened to like their life stories unfolding, that she felt sympathy for their circumstances. And I think that that's like a strength beyond a strength that I can even imagine, but something amazing and so beneficial to so many other people could come out of like such a terrible tragedy. So, and then I'm always interested in people's internal processes, in how you go from being, you know, just angry to looking at things no longer from just your own perspective, but from like the perspective of the community and what you might be able to do to save other people's children and to save like young people in that you don't even know or have a relationship with. That was amazing to me. There are organizations where people who have had that experience can come together and commemorate their loved ones, and but also talk about the experience, because when people say, oh, how are you? Nobody wants you to say, actually, my grief is overwhelming and I just don't know how to continue with my life. In those groups, people can be really honest about their feelings. So I know of those groups because I've spoken to those two mums, but there are also other online forums that you can just go on and be part of. So I did a lot of looking at some of those online forums, just so much tragedy, but also so much strength, and all of these people giving support to one another when actually they're suffering terribly themselves. So I had to feel around and look around at all of that.
That was, I think, one of the standout moments, if you like, in the book. And I'm so glad that you've covered that in a little detail. The family day, you know, I think I wrote in my notes that I'd never come across such a scene, if you like, before in a novel. And it was so moving. And, you know, it kind of brought me to tears. And I thought, it's so well structured, the scene, and the tones or the notes are just, you know, right. And I thought, damn, you know, that this is what needs to be written at times, but you found a way to do it. But there is a genre that is loosely called domestic noir, and they say that it centers around the family and generally the female experience. And in terms of your own novel, there's certainly moving cadences, if you like, between Marcia and Lloyd.
Yeah, so I think that often, not always, but often, women provide support to other women. And I think that we learn that from a very young age, that girls they talk about stuff and they talk about their feelings, whereas boys are sometimes toughened up a bit and are expected not to be a girl or act like a big girl's blouse, or, you know, to man up and to not explore their emotions quite as much. And then what often happens, I think, is that some men just don't have the vocabulary. They don't have the experience of speaking about how they feel or their emotions. So one of my favourite parts, the scene where Marcia observes that Lloydie didn't do the cuddling with Ryan, but he always left his dinner money on the table and he always checked his bike tires. And so his love is like demonstrated practically instead of verbally. And that's fine, actually, for Ryan. It would have been fine for Ryan to, wonderful for him to receive love, to know that his father loved him because of those things. And it would have been balanced by Marcia speaking to him and talking about, which she says, that she talked about everything with him, even very tiny things that he was upset about when he was young. She discussed them very seriously with him and took them seriously. I think that from Ryan's perspective, those differences wouldn't have been a big deal, but they do become a big deal in his absence, where now Marcia and Lloydie need to be able to share their grief and or communicate with each other and support each other. And Lloydie just doesn't have the language, the experience. He just can't do it. There's no catharsis for him. So he's not able to unload his grief, to lay it down. He's just literally like a pressure cooker with all of these feelings and emotions locked up inside him and no way out for them. And that can make communication really difficult. And again, when I was looking around at the trauma that parents go through, children who've been murdered, and I was looking at prominent couples whose children had died in violent circumstances, a lot of those couples have split up. I think it's part of that, maybe the weight of that grief, the enormity of that trauma. It's so big. Any breakdown in the ability of the two of you to communicate is going to be magnified. When I was writing The Mother, I didn't know whether or not by the end of the novel, Marcia and Lloydie were going to still be together. I didn't know how they would overcome that breach in their communication. I didn't know how they were going to do it until they did.
To turn to just some of the mechanics of the novel retained the tension, and the trial is part of that tension. And then again, the lovely way you wrong put the reader, in not giving the verdict. Did you do a lot of research for the trial scene? Because they all seem to roll very naturally.
It's really funny. I'm sure that you have to be like a partial masochist to become a novelist in the first place, because I had the idea and it just seemed so impossible, because I knew nothing at all about the law around knife crimes. I knew nothing about trials. So I literally had to start like at the absolute beginning. So I did lots of reading. I read an absolutely fantastic book called Devil's Advocate by Ian Morley, QC. And it's basically a step-by-step guide to courtroom advocacy and how to construct your case at trial. That was really, really useful. I read The Colour of Justice, Richard Norton Taylor's play, based on the transcripts of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. And so all of the language in there, it's almost taken verbatim from what was said in the inquiry. And so it's really rich, like in terms of courtroom dialogue. I went to the Old Bailey lots and sat in the public gallery. That's how I ended up with my public gallery scenes, because I hadn't even thought about the public gallery scenes being part of the novel. I found it absolutely astonishing that the families of both sides would be in the public gallery, that the front benches are reserved for those families. I attended murder trials at the Old Bailey, observed them from the public gallery, but I was also like observing the people in the front rows and able to work out from their responses to the evidence which side they were on. I think that is where that whole symbiotic relationship in the novel between what happens in the courtroom and Marcia and like all of the stuff that's going on emotionally with her. I think that's where that springs from, because I just thought it's devastating to not just lose somebody, but to go through the trial. It's so clinical to have their deaths described like an autopsy report in the courtroom, to have to listen to what happened over and over again. It must just be absolutely devastating. You know, it's like piling devastation on top of terrible trauma. And a couple of times there were fights in the public gallery as well, like between the two families, and then the case would come to a halt. And one of the cases, they decided that only one family could be in the public gallery at any one time, because they just couldn't occupy the same space without the disputes. I went to court quite a lot. And then my eldest daughter has a friend who is a barrister. So I spoke with a barrister, and she was kind enough to read through my manuscript and to give me feedback. In fact, she found an error in the middle of my novel that was catastrophic. And I had one of the characters say something on the stand that, had that have happened in real life, it would have brought the trial to an end, and they would have had to begin the whole process again. But
I think you incorporated that moment into the novel, I think.
So the second half of the novel went in some completely different directions as a consequence of her evidence. So I had to go back and change her evidence there, and then make quite substantial changes to the second half of the novel as well. So that I found really, really interesting, actually, as a process, because the novel ended up going in directions that I hadn't anticipated at all.
You pulled it off brilliantly. You know, it's very, very convincing. It's in the first person present tense, the novel. How did that come about? Was it something that you instantly did, or was it something you experimented with?
Both my novels have been written in first person. I've done quite a few short stories, and the majority of them are in the first person. I think it's because my interest is in exploring the stories of Black women and giving voice to them, because their experiences are so rich, so extraordinary. And yet their stories have been absent. Lots of women's stories have been absent historically anyway. But in particular, even now, Black women's voices are completely underrepresented. And there are so many really interesting, complex stories about their lives. I want to give voice to those stories. When I say I want to give voice to those stories, I literally want to give voice to those women. I don't want to write about them and what happens to them. I don't want that distance. I literally want their voices to speak through my work, so that there's no misunderstanding like what's going on with them or how they feel about the enormity of their interior landscape. I think that's why I tend to go for that perspective, and why I did it here as well.
Yeah, I think that it's that interior landscape that is the thing ultimately that I'm most interested in when I read novels or fiction. Me too. Yeah. And I think you made a valuable contribution in developing that voice. Well, it's lovely learning about your process. I think we all have our own curiosities around this. It's been a very successful process for you, and it's been lovely interviewing you. Thanks very much for sharing time with you.
Thank you. And thank you for all of your enthusiasm.